evening, everyone. Welcome to Books and Bridges, a humanities institute of ideas and conversation. Here we chase the thrill of all things profound, beautiful, and wise, wherever they may exist, and let them enrich our public interactions and personal relationships. This hunt, this search for a more meaningful life makes us better friends and citizens. There's far too much awe and wonder in life to bother with resentment and outrage. Dialogue, the kind that ventures beyond our contented borders and sees the bright and frightening vistas of other people's minds, is the heart of a pluralistic society. Tonight, we commemorate a man who enjoyed the title of our greatest living writer for many years until his recent death. The profound and jagged beauty of Cormac McCarthy's creations continue to enlarge our lives. We will explore the pulse of his work and ask, what makes Cormac McCarthy such a compelling voice in our time? What truths has he tapped into about the American myth, about the darkness and light in each soul, about universal human suffering and searching? The man saw deep into the pain of this world and never shirked from describing the vast, wonderful mystery honestly. His loss leaves a gaping hole in the world of ideas and literature. But we are grateful to have a smart guide paint a full picture for us here today. Dr. Stacey Peebles has taught at Centre College since 2011. She is an NEH Professor of Humanities, an Associate Professor and Chair of English, and Director of the Film Studies Program. She holds a BA, MA, and PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. Before coming to Centre, she was the Assistant Director of Lloyd International Honors College at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, and also worked as a professor and administrator in the Honors College of the University of Houston. Her most recent book is Cormac McCarthy and Performance, Page, Stage, Screen. Peebles is editor of the Cormac McCarthy Journal and president of the Cormac McCarthy Society. Dr. Peebles, we're honored to have you here. Thank you very much for coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Just start right in with asking you a question. In light of the very sad news of Cormac McCarthy's passing just about 9 days ago, I think. Since you've been living in his brain for so many years, what was your reaction to his passing? How did it feel for you?
Well, it's not, of course, unexpected since he was 89 at the time of his death. And we have known that he was ailing, as is sometimes common when you're that age, but it's still devastating. You always hope that there is more time. We were excited to hear that he was working with John Hillcoat on a potential film adaptation of Blood Meridian. And after the publication last year, The Passenger and Stella, these works that we had been anticipating for a really, really, really long time, there were those of us who thought, oh, I hope these aren't the last works. I hope he's got more. And then with that news about Blood Meridian, we thought, oh, this is great. This is great. There's another project. You're always eager for more, from the ones whose work you love so much. So it was a bit of a shock, even though, again, not completely unexpected. It struck me that it might be the kind of reaction a lot of people are familiar with when musicians that they adore pass away, music that's really meant a lot to you. But when we think of great musicians, we think of a lot of contemporary living musicians. But when you think of great authors, and you think of great books, so often you're talking about people in the past and not in the current moment when you're really thinking about that pantheon. So it was something of a different experience for sure.
Yeah, I think I'd been anticipating this for so long that I didn't quite know how to react. It was kind of emotional. It kind of hit me as a kind of a punch to the gut of sorts. But tell me what you think about what Cormac McCarthy means to the literary world. What does his loss mean, and how has it felt?
Well, there's a lot of ways to answer that. For a long time, the sobriquet that we gave him was, America's greatest living writer, especially after the death of Toni Morrison and Philip Roth, in recent years. And admittedly, certainly for me, that's a bit of a compromise, because I would just say, well, he's the greatest, certainly American author. So I think at this point, we can really start assessing what his career has meant and will mean. As I do think one of the greats, one of the ones whose work will live on, that we'll continue to return to, who has not just one, outstanding work of literature, but a number of them. There are certainly, novels of his that rise to the top of most people's estimation, but we fight about which one is the best. And that's, I think, a good sign for his, continuing legacy. But it's also the case that he had a really interesting career. He had a career that you probably couldn't have now as an author, both because of the way the publishing industry has changed, and also maybe just the absolute dedication that he always had to his craft. So whether you're thinking about the art itself or his career as a writer, I've always found him singular, and I think people will have a lot more to say about what his work was and what it meant.
Yeah. Cormac McCarthy was such a versatile writer, and he was such a versatile thinker. And oftentimes when we encounter big minds in the literary world, we think of the metaphor that Isaiah Berlin came up with, which is, the hedgehog and the fox. And he borrowed that from, the ancient Greek fragment from Archilochus, which basically means, that the hedgehog knows one big thing and the fox knows many little things. In your mind, do you think Cormac McCarthy is more of a hedgehog or is he more of a fox?
Well, he's got to be a fox, right? And again, I'm thinking a lot of these new novels, again, they just came out spring about a year ago, March. I'm sorry, not a year ago, back in the fall. That was when the advanced copies were released, back in the fall of 2022. And they have given us so much more to talk about. We always knew that he was interested in science alongside all the other things he was interested in, and mathematics. But these are tours de force, in those areas, and we have so much more homework to do, right? So for an author who's always been interested in notions of truth and reality and how we know the world, science and mathematics have given him a new narrative lens to pursue those questions through. So I suppose, I guess I could, give, both the hedgehog and the fox a little bit of play and say, well, sure, he's always asking the same questions, but he's answering them differently. He's got different ideas about the ways that we can think about those questions or wrestle with those questions. He's not doggedly pursuing the same thesis over and over again. I don't think you could be a great artist, even a great philosopher, right? Which we tend to expect a little more consistency, perhaps. From philosophers, we want them to be consistent throughout their career. Novelists, I think we maybe expect to grow and change and play with different approaches. So I think maybe he's a hedgehog in the kinds of questions he keeps asking, but he's a fox in the way that he keeps answering them in lots of different kinds of ways.
Yeah, well put. Thanks. I think literary legacy is on our minds, and how that works. How does literary memory work? How does a legacy form after the death of an author? And I can't help but think of authors like, F. Scott Fitzgerald or Herman Melville, who enjoy great popularity now, but at the time of their death, they were fairly obscure, especially Melville. How do you think Cormac McCarthy will fare in about 50 to 100 years or more? What's your opinion on that?
Well, he labored in obscurity, relative obscurity, for the first several decades of his career. He was writing, in the 60s. His first novel is 1965, but it's not until 1992 that he has anything, not even fame, but anything like a good selling novel, right? The first 5 books sold less than 5,000 copies apiece. I mean, he was not making money. And yet, even then, when he was not known, he was known as a writer's writer, which is a little bit of a blessing and a curse, right? It means that you're good. It just means that nobody's heard of you. And yet people were talking, the word was starting to spread. People who appreciated, great literature were starting to pay attention. So I tend to think that it's the work that matters. And regardless of the fame, his work would have steadily built and built. But the fame accelerates, I think, that process, and the renown. And so, every news outlet carried, news of his passing. It was laudatory. But even more than journalism or the press, which is ephemeral at best, right? That attention comes and goes pretty fast. But to give academics like myself some credit, I mean, we teach him. And I think in a classroom, in whether you're talking about a traditional classroom or not, right? Groups of people who want to read his stuff together and talk about it, I think that's where the real legacy is. Because if you don't have the conversation, if people just say, oh yeah, that's good, but I don't ever want to read it, or, I want to acknowledge it, but I'm not really interested. His work is interesting. It really gets people talking. And so I think, again, both academics and non-academics, I think that ongoing conversation is probably what will ensure his continued relevance.
And that brings up the question in my mind, who is responsible for doing the legacy building? Who does that? Is it the reading public? Is it, as you say, the academics? Combination of both, the media?
I mean, it's really everything. And again, I'm biased. I'm a professor, but I think if authors keep getting taught, I mean, there are authors that were taught a lot more, decades ago, and then they kind of fade. But then there's others, like you mentioned, Fitzgerald and Melville. We still think we still think they have something to give, right? We still think it's, they're worth reading now, that it's also worth assigning their work to 18-year-olds, right? Or younger, right? High school, and having them wrestle with it. And so I think that notion of canon, in the sense of, you can debate about your opinions about the ivory tower, but it's a place where conversations happen about books. I mean, that is, I think, one of the central missions there. And so if people are still talking and finding that relevant, I think that's hugely important. But not to discount, I mean, the larger reading public, when news of his death spread, Blood Meridian popped to the top, some bestseller list, which was surprising. It wouldn't be my first guess at a beach read for folks heading out on vacation, but again, that curiosity, this, we've heard that this is important. We've heard that this matters. We've heard that, there's something here that's worth thinking about.
Which books or book do you think will stand the test of time and rise above the others?
We can have a nice fight about that with other people who study McCarthy. I'm a Blood Meridian person myself. I always say I think that's the masterpiece. There were some notices in the press that said, oh no, his masterpiece is The Road. And certainly, that was the one that is probably the most widely read and the most popular in that sense. So some people will certainly, it's very different, right? They're very different works in a lot of ways, but a lot of people say, no, that's the one. That's the one that is the masterwork. But Suttree, his novel Suttree, has its adherents. And there are folks who love the second novel of the Border trilogy, which is The Crossing, which is a quite difficult book, but beautiful in its way. I think that's a bit of a deep cut in in McCarthy's history, but it's also one that I think people, who knows, maybe that's the one that we'll be talking about. But and then of course the new novels, which we've only barely begun to reckon with and grapple with, The Passenger and Stella Maris. But for my money, if you're asking me personally, then I would say Blood Meridian. I think that's the one that speaks to the most ideas and is the most awe-inspiring as a work of literature.
Yeah, tell us more about that book. What are, that's a broad question, but what's the idea of that book? I mean, I've heard it called a Gnostic tragedy. And that would probably need to be unpacked greatly, but there's this sense that the problem of evil is inexplicable. It can't be plumbed, it can't be fully grasped, and it's left to kind of linger as the book does. Any thoughts?
Well, let me situate it a little bit first in terms of his career. Since McCarthy, he was born in Rhode Island, but he grew up in Tennessee, right, in and around Knoxville. And his first 4 novels are Southern novels. They're set in that area in the South. And, he was kind of thought of as a Southern novelist. That was the genre that he was working in. And then he publishes Blood Meridian in 1985. And this is wildly different in many ways than what he's done before. It's a new region. It's set in the Texas-Mexico borderlands. It's set in 1849 for the most part. And it is nominally a Western, which, he has said, he was interested in at the time, but it doesn't read like any kind of Western that you've seen before. And the easy way to answer the question, well, why is that? Is, well, it's very violent, but there's more to it than that. I mean, Peckinpah did violent Westerns too, right? But McCarthy is doing something different with it. It's a novel that's historically based. It is based on the main historical source is a book called My Confession by Sam Chamberlain, who's a kind of model for the main character. And yet most readers are not familiar with that historical basis or those historical sources. It's based on the life, it's the part of Sam Chamberlain's life when he joined what's called the Glanton Gang, which was led by John Glanton. And this was a group of scalp hunters. They were paid by the Mexican government to hunt and kill Native Americans in the borderlands during this period. And they were partially financed by the United States government as well, as a way of essentially, clearing that area for commerce. For settlement and commerce. But it's not a historical novel in the way that Gone with the Wind is, where your average reader will say, oh, yes, I can identify, the burning of Atlanta or whatever. Most readers don't recognize the sources. So that's certainly, that history is one layer of this very troubled, kind of violent time in American history and border history. And yet there's all these other layers to it. There's a philosophical layer, which you alluded to. There's all this incredible detail about the region, the environment, the natural environment. You have the musicality of the language itself, which is elusive to literary history in all kinds of different ways. And then it's also a kind of puzzle, as you sort of alluded to as well. What do you do with all of this? What does the ending mean? So it's a very challenging novel. Even just the vocabulary that he uses words that you don't find in a standard dictionary, for instance. His punctuation is non-standard. He doesn't go as far as Faulkner, but these kinds of non-standard practices can be a bit confronting as well. So it is just a behemoth of a book. There's a lot to do with it, but that's what makes it so much fun to talk about. And I do think at some level, the project of the book is, as you say, what are we talking about when we talk about evil? Are we talking about human violence, just human violence against one another, which has, plagued us forever? Are we talking about something supernatural? are we talking just about the absence of morality, wherever that comes from, whether it's law, whether it's the divine, whatever you want to describe it as, which in some sense is interesting because maybe the Western as a genre is always kind of asking that question. What do you do in a place where there aren't those strictures, right? How do we figure out how to deal with each other in the frontier, right? In the open, when things aren't established? Who do we look to, if anyone, for what to do, what we might call right or what we might call wrong? And so when people read the book, they often do focus, I think, on the most violent part and the most violent character, who is Judge Holden, who does have at least one like historical counterpart. But then I also read it as a portrait of the main character, who's this nameless kid who resists that in some tiny way. Why does he do that? Nothing around him has taught him how to be good or how to be merciful. And he's not, but he does at least try, which I think is so if we say it's a novel about what evil is, I think we also have to say, but where does good come from? That it's a novel that's also asking that question. Arguably maybe the most fundamental questions that we can ask.
Do you see an Ishmael Ahab counterpart between the kid and the judge? Or even a Moby Dick resonance there?
Certainly the Moby Dick connections have been well plumbed. It is, I do think that like Moby Dick, it's a big shaggy novel. Moby Dick, it's hard to know what to do with some of the sections, and Blood Meridian can feel like that at times. People have certainly likened the judge to Ahab, but they've also likened him to the whale itself, big and white and bald and somehow unreckonable. What does the whale stand for? What does Judge Holden stand for? And we're all kind of chasing it to figure out what to do with it. So yeah, I think I definitely think McCarthy is very Melvillian, and probably no more so than in Blood Meridian.
Talk about his language and his style of language. He has many admirers, whether it's Saul Bellow once said that his use of language is overpowering. Harold Bloom, the late critic, is famous for being kind of overwhelmed by the grandeur of his language. He called Blood Meridian the ultimate Western. David Foster Wallace was a big fan of the book. Cormac McCarthy, and then I guess the quote I'm thinking of is from Robert Penn Warren. He said this about McCarthy. He said, "McCarthy is a born narrator, and his writing has line by line the stab of actuality." What do you think he means by the stab of actuality? It's a great phrase.
It's a great phrase. I can answer that in two ways. I think on the one hand, that could be said to describe what I most like about McCarthy, and any great writer, and this is again just me, but I like a writer who can stop me with a sentence where I'm reading. I mean, it's not, plot is great, a great character. I mean, these are personal tendencies, I suppose, but I like an amazing sentence. I like one that just stops me cold, that I have to sit with, that I thought it makes me think I've never quite put my brain in that spot before, and heard something quite like that before. It's both intellectual and musical and emotional, right, all at the same time. Although that phrase, the stab of actuality, it kind of reminds me of Werner Herzog's idea of the ecstatic truth, right? Herzog is a filmmaker, and when he makes documentaries, he's talked about this is what film should be about, this ecstatic truth that is not literal. It's not bound to literal truth, but it's trying to give you a kind of transcendent moment. And interesting to me because there is this NPR interview you can listen to between McCarthy, Werner Herzog, and Lawrence Krauss talking about the connections between science and art. So they have met. I mean, they did share this conversation. But I think that idea of again, it's not maybe the idea of a literal truth, but something that grabs you and arrests you, because I might prefer the idea of the creation of a kind of ecstasy over stabbing, but it grabs you by the throat, right? In this way that you want to be immobilized by the way this artist has done something, at least for a while.
Yeah, great, thanks. Tell us about the literary pedigree of Cormac McCarthy. Who are his, literary brothers and sisters? What is his literary family? His forebears?
Well, the most commonly discussed, of course, one is Faulkner, writing in the South. This is unavoidable, but it is true that his first editor, Albert Erskine, was also Faulkner's editor late in his life. And so there's a quite identifiable, lineage there. Some people, of course, say, well, maybe this is why he started writing Westerns instead of writing Southern novels, to get out of that inevitable comparison or get away from that shadow. But certainly, some of the concerns, some of the stylistics are there, although he, from the beginning wanted to, forge his own path. In an equal but very different way, Hemingway, right? Because of Hemingway's subject matter, some of the things that he wrote about. And then also, oddly enough, also that style, right? McCarthy is as terse with dialogue often, and not all the time, but often. And he's not always revealing of characters' interiority in the way that Hemingway, withheld some of those kinds of things. But to play the literary forebears game is, it's a long conversation. I mean, people do talk about Dostoevsky, they talk about the European tradition, Shakespeare. I mean, I would go to Euripides. He's a writer that's interested in tragedy, I think, not always in ways that are completely legible or visible, but that strain is always there, this idea that choices matter, and not necessarily in a strictly didactic kind of way. But he was a reader. He read voraciously and with great interest, certainly great literature, but not just literature, nonfiction as well. So Plato, we know he's quite interested in Plato, and that's evident, I think, in a lot of his works. So it's good company. I think he's in pretty good company.
Explore more the Plato connection, if you could.
Well, I think Diane Luce has done some of the best work on this, thinking about the way that Platonic ideas are evident in his work. I always like her reading of Child of God, which, has a character who is kind of flailing. He cannot find an authentic way to live, and so he retreats into a literal cave by the end of the novel. His company is with dead people, not living people. He can't figure out how to be illuminated, right, in that sense. And so his own tragedy, if you want to put it that way, is that he can't get away from the shadows. He can't find a way out. So I think that, that notion of and again, the interest in reality, what we mean by reality and what it means to know the world, is one that he's exploring in a lot of his work. But then it becomes differently inflected in the new novels. Again, Alicia Western, the sister in these two new novels, The Passenger and Stella Maris, is a mathematician, and she talks specifically about mathematical Platonism, the idea that math or number is a real thing, that it would exist independent of humans, And she resists that. I mean, she says that's clearly not true. Mathematics is a semiotic system, a representation just like language or anything else constructed by humans. What does she say at one point? I don't know about you, but as for me, I've never seen a 6, right? But she also seems to desperately want to believe that something like that, because she thinks math is beautiful. And so she has this great line at one point about, I think when everything is going into darkness, those mathematical truths might glimmer for just a moment in the final light before darkness takes everything. And so there is, I mean, this is a character who is quite literally wrestling with this question and calling it Platonism. So it is right there on the surface in these final novels. So I think it becomes quite overt near the end of his career, but that's that kind of question. How do you know the world? Do things like numbers or concepts or love or justice, do they exist in some way that we can think of, outside of ourselves?
Yeah, and that does introduce the dichotomy, you could say, between, two of McCarthy's preoccupations, which was the scientific life and the moral life. And somehow those two have to fit together because they're such inextricably linked part of being human.
Right. And then one of the other big elements in The Passenger is the Manhattan Project. The two siblings' father worked on the Manhattan Project and supported it. I mean, did not think that it was a problem, even though there were other. I mean, this is a fictional character, I should note, not somebody based on, obviously there were scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project, but this fictional father is not one of them in real life. But we know, right, that there were physicists who, when it was determined that the Nazis, were not going to develop an atomic bomb, said, well, this is not a tenable pursuit, right? And so atomic power, nuclear power is something that, I mean, McCarthy touches on. It shows up in The Crossing earlier in his career. This kind of, I mean, we tend to associate McCarthy with descriptions of hand-to-hand violence, war, physical violence, grappling. But he's also thinking about the way that science and technology and that kind of development could lead to another level. And of course, when you're thinking about the road, it's never clear what this apocalypse was. It could very well be nuclear. And so in that sense, what does science mean? What does technological advancement mean for us? And in that sense, I think for him, he'd say, well, it has to be inextricable from morality, because everything is inextricable at some level from morality.
A friend, Professor Scott Abbott, one time pointed out to me that the ending of The Crossing takes place under the cloud of the detonation of an atomic bomb in New Mexico, and I didn't even make that connection when I first read it.
No, I mean, you don't. I don't think I did either, because the Trinity test is not named, but the character is Billy Parham is awoken by this odd dawn in the middle of the night, and all the animals are behaving strangely, and he's not quite sure what's going on. And then he goes back to bed. But then at the end of the novel, there's a line about, and then the right and God made sun did rise, right? So the idea of the Trinity test is a false dawn, a false sun.
Yeah, that is one of his more legendary lines, one of my favorite lines of his body of work, for sure. I have to say, The Crossing is my favorite of his books.
So you're one of those. So, good. I think it needs more adherence, right?
Yeah. What can you tell us about Cormac McCarthy's religious worldview, his religious sensibility? We've talked about the moral life, but could you say more?
Well, he was raised Catholic. He went to Knoxville Catholic High School, and so has that education, that knowledge. And I think his work, grapples with those questions. All of the novels, maybe most overtly The Road, where God is both present and not present in some ways. And The Sunset Limited is his play, which is another one that asks some of the same questions. But when he sat down upon the publication of The Road with Oprah Winfrey, which shocked a lot of us when he did that, she was a great interviewer. She asked him a lot of hard questions, and one was, do you believe in God? And he said, it depends on which day you ask me. Which is probably evident in his work as well. But he went on to say, but I think that prayer is good. I think regardless of the God thing, the God question, that prayer is a good act because it's indicative of gratitude, and gratitude is important. Being grateful for not just the things in your life, but things in the world, things you might have. And when you think about considering that in light of reading The Road, that becomes a little bit more clear. It's in sharper contrast. But I think you can't erase God from his work, but God is very rarely present. There are, some characters who say, God talked to me. One is Black in The Sunset Limited, and then another is Debussy Fields, right? Debussy in the new novel, The Passenger. And they both say, after this, this was when I believed, right? That God spoke to me and said, essentially, you are here. There's a reason you're here. Your life has purpose. But you certainly see other characters like the father in The Road, grappling with that. Again, the problem of evil, these age-old questions, how could God let these things happen? But it's a steady current that runs, I think, throughout all of his work in different ways.
You have been on record as being an admirer of The Child of God, or is it just Child of God?
Child of God, right.
His third book. Harold Bloom has been on record as saying that The Child of God will make the canon eventually. I think he said that. Does that book represent something like divine grace being extended to the lowest of the low? Something like that?
I do think it's one of the books that the general public is less familiar with, but that I think it's one of his best. I think it will be one of the ones that is, that has an afterlife, that has a long legacy, and maybe will overtake some of the others over time. We'll see. Now, one of the most striking things about that book, and this is another thing that Diane Luce has pointed out in her work, it's based at least in part, very loosely, on the story of Ed Gein, a serial killer. And he was also, again, very loosely the basis for Psycho, the film by Hitchcock, and then the novel before that. And if you look at the two titles that are dealing with something like the same material, then that's really telling, right? One is just called Psycho. It's a bit lurid. It's accusatory, and the other is Child of God, which is not what's the word I want? Telling you what to think about that character. I mean, the famous line in the book is that this guy, Lester Ballard, is a child of God, much like yourself, perhaps. And so the perhaps is a weighty word there. And that's what you're asked to think about. And that's another book you mentioned, again, Evil, the Nature of Evil. It steadfastly refuses to call this character evil, who does some pretty bad stuff. He's a murderer, he's a necrophiliac, and these are not things that a lot of readers would find sympathetic. And yet he has a tragic life. As I mentioned earlier, he doesn't have community, he doesn't have family, nobody accepts him, everybody pushes him away. So this is what he turns to for some kind of solace. No, I've always thought that that was a perfect little jewel of a novel. It's not one of his massive doorstops. It's pretty short. It's spare. It's very haunting. And so I think it's quite profound. It's difficult. I've taught it a number of times. It's probably my favorite book of his to teach, because it is so well done and so difficult to know what you're supposed to think about it.
I see a Dostoevsky connection there in some of these broad notions of just the depths of the potential depths of depravity within human beings, but also this inborn spark for aspiration towards the longing and the divinity. Perhaps.
Well, I mean, that's human community, right? I mean, it's the source of our greatest comfort and the greatest danger at the same time, the things that we're capable of.
And well put. Yeah, I like that. Well, let me ask one more question before I open it up to everyone else. And that is a kind of elliptical question on purpose. What is Cormac McCarthy's warning to us in the modern age?
Warning to us. I'll take a line from The Passenger, because again, these are his most recent. These are the ones that those of us who love McCarthy are really excited about getting to keep talking about, in the coming years. But there's a great line where one character, Bobby Western, is thinking about something. He's just had a long conversation with a friend, and he says, God's goodness appears in strange places. Don't close your eyes. So I think that's the warning: is don't close your eyes. You don't. I think one of the reasons that McCarthy tackles some of the subject matter that he does and pushes us as readers in the way that he does is we go through the world and we get so used to what we expect to see, just in our daily lives, but also in, the stories. There's lots and lots of stories, right? This media we consume, the books we read, so much falls into the same patterns. That's not bad. It's just life. It's just, our nature. But you can't, you have to keep seeing. I mean, you can't do it all the time. You can't go through every single day, right? Like, having what did Andre Bazin call it? A holy moment. You can't do that all the time. Art is what reminds us, look at this, right? See differently. Don't forget how to see something new, something fresh, because that's sometimes where the good stuff is, that you would maybe otherwise miss.
That's brilliant. I like that. Thank you. Let's open this to questions. We already have a question from Chris Jensen, and he's referring to an earlier topic you were mentioning before about the publication history and how Cormac McCarthy would have or would have not excelled in that environment. He asks, how has publication changed through the last 50 years, and how would McCarthy have adjusted to this different environment today?
Well, he probably would not have. He didn't have an agent for many, many years. He sent his first manuscript to Random House blind. Just, here you go. And to their credit, first Lawrence Bensky and then later Albert Erskine, read it and thought, this has potential. It needs some work, but we don't know who this guy is. But he's doing something really interesting that's worth cultivating. McCarthy is often called a recluse, has also often been called a recluse, which is not accurate. We know what he looks like. He's not Pynchon or Salinger, right? But he certainly has not actively pursued, he certainly never actively pursued a media life. And he resisted giving talks about his writing again and again and again, even when he needed the money, because he thought it wasn't good for you as a writer to keep selling yourself, or to keep talking about your process when you needed to be doing your process, right? So I think, and a lot of people have said this upon his passing, I don't think you certainly could not have that career now. I wonder if you could, if it would be possible to hold that part of yourself back that you felt like you needed to these days, when marketing works so differently and it's such a bigger part of how everything works, right?
Yeah.
So no, I think he could have still had a career because he was so uninterested in being famous or having a great deal of money. He just wanted to get by for a long time. But if I can't see him having an Instagram page.
In fact, that reminds me of his response to Oprah when she asked the same question, which is basically regarding, self-promotion. He says, I don't like what it does to your head.
Right.
Something like that.
And that's not wrong.
Yeah. So another viewer asks, what would you say are McCarthy's thoughts on technology?
Probably interesting, but dangerous. I mean, so many of his novels feature characters who are resisting modernity. I mean, this is his first novel, The Orchard Keeper. That's a really big thread in that. All the Pretty Horses, you've got a character who wants to run a ranch, wants to run his family ranch, but that is not really a paying proposition in 1949 in Texas in the same way that it had been. You can't ride your horse straight down to Mexico because of all the barbed wire, right? I mean, part of that is apocryphal, and part of that is just a mythic understanding of the past. But I think there's a healthy and sometimes an unhealthy suspicion of that kind of progress, at least on the part of his characters, right? It's always got to be clear, talking about the characters, not the author, but there's not, I can't think of too many characters in McCarthy, or maybe any, who think of technology as an untrammeled good, or that kind of development. Unless I tend to think of scientific technology and that kind of advancement. If you're talking about, tools, that might be different, right? Or writing as a technology, things like that, that's a bit different. But then I'm getting metaphorical, I think.
Coming from a man who never ceased using a typewriter.
Right, yeah, till the very end, Olivetti typewriter. Hear the clack, got to hear the clack.
Yeah. So we have another question from Jeffrey Early Mera. Brings us to All the Pretty Horses, which we haven't really discussed much. And I'm not sure, this is an interesting question. Why was John Grady Cole's mother in San Diego in 1942?
Is that the last time his father sees his mother? I'm trying to remember. Because I know his father has a line, the last time I saw her, but I thought it was San Antonio. 1942, that might be wrong. I don't remember. That is interesting. I mean, if I had to guess, I'd say, she once, she was, well, that would have been during the war. I don't know. Who knows? I mean, the father was at war, right? And in a POW camp, John Grady Cole's father. So maybe it was some friend or family that in his absence, she traveled to see. But I'd have to do my homework. I'd have to sit here and do my homework to try to think about it. But it's an interesting question. She moved around. I mean, it seems like she was starting to move around a lot. She wasn't there for part of John Grady Cole's childhood. That's why, Abuela is really the person who was more of a maternal figure for him growing up. So that might have just been part of her peregrination at the same time.
I think her absence does cast a kind of pall over the entire book in some ways, behind the scenes.
Right.
So another question from Robert Burkle. What do you believe is the role of literary societies after an author's passing?
Great question, since we've been talking about this. Well, our job I mean, I speak as the president of the McCarthy Society, which, I just took over this role from Steve Fry, who stepped down really just a matter of weeks ago, coincidentally. Our job is not to speak to the public about the man personally, or to, just give, to burnish his legend as our project, right? We're academics, we study. We study him, teach him, enjoy his work. It's not to make an argument for his greatness as a kind of publicity, right? So I think that's important. That's something that we've actually been in conversation about. Again, lots of people study authors that are no longer living, and this is not an issue. But I think it's important for us to continue to, as the society's main mission is to provide venues for conversation. We publish the journal. People can publish academic articles. They can come to conferences. They can interact in other ways that we try to facilitate. So I think just giving people places to talk about these ideas and about the work, to the exclusion maybe of other kinds of practices that are not in our purview.
Well said. Another question from Ryan Keith. Do you feel that The Passenger and Stella Maris are good final novels for such a prolific author in regards to how popular his previous work is?
I think they're fantastic. Not everybody thinks so. They are somewhat divisive, which I think is fine. But I did get an advance copy of the two novels so that we could have them reviewed for the McCarthy Journal, which was terrific. So I got to look at them before most people had seen them, and I started to read. And one of my first, and there's some trepidation, right? Because these were his first novels since The Road, which was 2006. It's a long time to wait for new novels. And there's some trepidation, like, I hope it's good. And starting to read and think, oh, it's good. Yeah, it's good. This is difficult, provocative, it's challenging. All his stuff is like that, though. Even The Road, this is a novel, again, maybe his most popular, which is post-apocalyptic, but it's not like other books in that genre, not least because there is no consideration for what the cataclysm was. That is a kind of provocative maneuver for that genre. So in that sense, I'm glad that they are somewhat divisive. I'm glad that some people don't know what to make of them, because I think that's McCarthy being uncompromising, and the way he always has been. So I was very, very happy. And they'll certainly keep academics like me in business for a long time, which is also nice.
Yeah. So another question from Professor Scott Abbott. The Crossing, and here's a quote: "The old man, by whatever instinct, stood on ground at once blessed and fraughtful." And then Scott says, Dostoevsky's The Idiot, and he quotes again, "Blessedness is only possible in the most fraughtful situations. In Prince Mushkin's moment of absolute insight at the onset of a seizure, for instance." Scott asks, perhaps the violence of McCarthy's work puts us, through his characters, in fraughtful and potentially blessed situations.
I think so. I think that's one way of talking about his project. Again, he said in an interview with Richard Woodward, I like literature that tackles tough, that's big. He doesn't like, Henry James particularly, right? And, again, that's taste, but the stories that McCarthy was interested in and that he wrote were ones that were quite difficult. But again, it's in that provocation, that difficult honesty that, he says, if you're really going to talk about being human, you have to do that. You can't just talk about the blessedness, right? That doesn't, you're not really embarking on an understanding of morality if you're only thinking about the good. obviously, right? And McCarthy, yeah, doesn't just talk about the good. He doesn't just talk about the bad either. And I think in some of those moments, it's both. And that's us, right? As people.
There is an interesting intersection between some of the Russian experience, some of the American experience, in that, Russians are famously known for containing within them the extremes of extravagant generosity and kindness, but also, deep darkness. And I think the American experience, as Blood Meridian shows, is very full of a darkness that haven't reckoned with.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Dostoevsky connection is very apropos here.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay, James O'Sullivan asks, any plans for a McCarthy conference on McCarthy and the atom bomb? A reminder, 2025 will mark the 80th anniversary of the Trinity Project and Hiroshima.
Especially given the new novels, that would be apt. It's also one of the anniversaries of Blood Meridian, which we sometimes do mark. But we're going to have a symposium on the new novels coming up this coming fall. The McCarthy Society tries to do something, a conference that's solely devoted to McCarthy's work at least every 2 years. 2 years in the United States, and then in the off years, we sometimes do an international conference or a smaller symposium. So that would be, I think an appropriate theme to look at for sure.
Okay. From a viewer, from the passenger came this powerful sentence, quote, "In that my coital phantom blooming in the dawn like an evil phantom, and in the melting of solids not heretofore known, to do so stood a truth that would silence poetry 1,000 years," unquote. Doesn't that sentence capsize his worldview?
Well, it might. I mean, because, well, he's obviously writing. So if you consider that poetry, he doesn't think it's been silenced. I have to look at the context. Sometimes McCarthy's writing is difficult because you have these sentences and it's unclear if they are taking in one of the characters' perspectives, even when they're not, direct quotations or clearly a reflection of their own consciousness. The road is probably the most interesting here, since a lot of it is from the father's perspective, but sometimes it's hard to tell what's the narrator and what's the father. So I'd probably have to look at the context, but I think that's something that he has considered, that when you have, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you have a different moment of human history. But then you think about some of his other work, like No Country for Old Men, where Uncle Ellis tells Sheriff Bell, it's always been bad, right? Like things are not getting worse because this stuff has been with us. And this is, Sheriff Bell, who's dealt with Anton Chigurh, this thing that he says, this kind of evil, he says he's never really, considered before or understood, thought about before. But his uncle's like, no, I mean, human life has always been, rent by violence. So whether or not McCarthy sees the nuclear age as something different or just a creative new way for us to hurt each other, I don't know. I think it's an argument. It's an open question.
That is a very difficult question to answer. And it recalls in my mind the interview that McCarthy did with Lawrence Krauss. It was pretty recent. I think it was just a few months ago. And in that interview, Cormac McCarthy did say, he kind of said it rhetorically, but he said, does anyone really believe that poetry exists anymore? Something kind of like that. It was a haunting phrase that left me a little bit hurt. Poetry can't die, can it?
Well, and you got to watch him. He's I mean, especially I think in that interview, he's dancing a little bit, you know, he doesn't want to be put in a box. Arguably he never has wanted that, you know, don't, I don't want to talk too much to the public because you say something, right? And then it's married to you for the rest of your career. And then everybody, you know, reads your stuff through that. And I think, so I think, you know, I think grain of salt, maybe.
That's a good way of putting it. An anonymous attendee asks, says, Stacey, McCarthy's work on Blood Meridian screenplay, do you know if versions of this exist, or was he likely starting from scratch? Also, are there other unpublished works?
I unfortunately don't know anything about the screenplay. Maybe we will hear the current one that John Hillcoat is working on. Maybe we'll hear more about that from him in the future. As far as other stuff, there certainly are things that have remained unpublished. There's a screenplay called Whales and Men that he never pursued. Well, he pursued it, but I mean, it never got picked up, and he never pursued publishing it in another form. You know, he wrote poetry in high school. He wrote short stories in college. Those have never been reprinted outside of their original venues. He was never interested in that. The short stories are pretty easy to find online if you're interested. But other than that, we're not sure. His archive, his papers and manuscripts are at Texas State University in San Marcos, but those were purchased in, I want to say 2008. I might be slightly off, but my point is that I hope that Texas State, the Whitliff Collections there, successfully purchases the rest of his archive, but that has yet to be negotiated and completed, at least to my knowledge. And so we won't. So if you want to see that kind of stuff, that's where you go to look at his, you know, his files, right? His archives, all that kind of stuff. That's where you can see Whales and Men and take a look at it. So whether or not there will be other stuff when we're able to, you know, access the archive from the remainder of his life, we'll just have to see, wait and see.
Thanks. Olivia Ojeda asks, why do you think the opening scene of Stella Maris with Alicia hanging between the trees mirrors the Lady of the Rocks scene in Blood Meridian? Did McCarthy mirror scenes often in his work like this?
There's a lot of echoes. I think the new novels have echoes of all kinds of stuff. There's a lot of Suttree in them. I mean, both general kind of tone things as well as specifics. Yeah, that a character has committed suicide. Suicide is something that he has explored in The Road and in The Sunset Limited. You know, you can see, I mean, obviously, you know, echoes of The Crossing because of the nuclear, you know, the nuclear element. So yeah, I mean, certainly, like I think some of the most common stuff, if you think about The Road and the idea of carrying the fire, which is something that in that novel, the father and son repeat to each other as a way of talking about being good, even in this world where that is decidedly not an advantage to do so. But then you look at No Country for Old Men, and that story, both the novel and then the film adaptation, ends with Sheriff Bell thinking about this dream that he had of his father carrying fire in a horn, the way people used to do, and riding ahead of him into the mountains to make a fire, and then he'll catch up. So that's a good example of like a really obvious mirroring. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of that in McCarthy. There are images, maybe not quite that overt, but that get picked up and reworked and used in a different way.
Something to watch for as we continue to read. Two more questions left. One is from Jim Vasilovich. Any sense if there's anything else significant in the archives that we might see released someday?
I'm guessing you mean something like unpublished. If I had to, I'm not sure, because again, like I said, we haven't seen all of the archive yet, but I would guess even if there was, it's not going to be published. I think McCarthy was pretty clear about what he wanted to be published and what he wanted not to be published. It would have been people have asked over the years, can we publish these, short stories that you wrote and, and that were in the literary magazine of the University of Tennessee when you were in college? Not interested. It was even relatively rare for excerpts from his novels to appear in anthologies and things like that. So he had it seems to me he had pretty set ideas about what he wanted out there in the world being published, and then what was a matter really like for scholars or interested parties who could see it in the archives. He didn't burn everything, which is great. But the line for him seems to have been pretty clear, which to me would probably negate the idea of anything posthumous coming out right after his passing.
You know of anyone who is currently working on a biography and who is gathering material for that?
There have been attempts over the years. None have come to fruition in the sense of a traditional biography. And I'll mention her name again because it's impossible not to, but Diane Luce recently wrote a book called Embracing Vocation, which is about McCarthy's writing career. It's like the first part of it. She's continuing that project, on through the later parts of his career. And she looks at like manuscripts and basically tells the story of, okay, what was he working on? What was he doing? What was his writing process? And that's different from a biography in the way that, we think about it. I hope, but he was a private person. He really was not, he certainly was not interested in pursuing that himself in some way, shape, or form. So we'll see. I think we'll know enough that we'll have one eventually. How complete it will be in terms of aspects of, say, his personal life, how that might have affected, his career. Not sure.
Excellent. Okay, one more question from Anonymous. What's your opinion on Bobby and Alicia Western's relationship in The Passenger? What is McCarthy trying to convey with such a controversial, beautiful love?
That I might have to give an academic paper to fully answer that. I will say something about it and confine myself to things in the first few pages of The Passenger, since not everybody has had a chance to read those new ones. But Bobby and Alicia Western are brother and sister. They are both brilliant. They are in love. They are not in a relationship, but they love each other deeply. And Alicia particularly is... Bobby is the only man that she would ever love in a complete and kind of total way. So McCarthy, who's always been interested in taboo, necrophilia, cannibalism, all of these things, is thinking about incest here, which is a topic he's done before in Outer Dark, his second novel, in fact, in a different kind of context. But so this is a love that is never consummated. It's not pursued in any kind of physical way, but it exists. And it is, I'll use this word again, I think heavy with tragedy. Because Alicia in particular, troubled person, absolutely brilliant, just a visionary in many ways, but she can't have the one thing that this sounds weird to say, would give her some semblance of a normal life experience, right? No, I find it, this is a book, these two new novels, they're heavy with ideas. Alicia does topology, topos theory in mathematics, which is intensely conceptual. She's dealing with mathematical shapes that can't be visualized, and there's no way to represent them in the real world. So she's way up here. It's the Manhattan Project. It's all this kind of local history. It's a mystery, but I do think the emotional core is this very difficult and yet illuminating emotional bond that you have to read about, figure out what you think is going on, and then watch and see how you're moved by it. And if you are, and if so, what moves you? So again, it's McCarthy playing with some pretty difficult questions, but yeah, I find it kind of astonishing. It's something he hasn't done before in that way. And just like everything else, it's not easy and there's no easy answers, but gosh, it's great to talk about and think about.
Yeah, nice answer. Anonymous attendee asks, any information on the Cormac McCarthy library his brother Dennis is setting up? I saw it mentioned by his friend Dennis Francis after McCarthy's passing.
I don't have any. I think that that's something that has been discussed and is in the works, but at least on my end, from the society's perspective, that's not something we're intimately involved with. Obviously, that'd be really exciting. Because I think that's appropriate. I mean, you can go to Hemingway's house, right? You can go see these literary landmarks for other authors. And so it would be, of course, only too appropriate to have something like that for McCarthy. That is I think, a small thing perhaps in an author's legacy, but it's not to be discounted. A kind of place, a physical place where you can go and learn more about the author, experience something about how they lived, what they read, right, what they thought about. I think that would be terrific.
Jeffrey Erlihi Mera asks another question. Context on the San Diego question. A removed phrase in the manuscript available at Whitliff says Cole's mother was in a movie when she was 18. I wondered if you thought she returned to California to pursue acting, given her career in San Antonio when the novel takes place. I doubt she went to see John Grady's father off to war, given their cold relationship, and since John Grady was 9 at the time. Hard to get to Cali from Texas then, too. If she went there to live and became an actress, John Grady spent very little time with his mother in Texas, it seems, which in a sense Mexicanizes his boyhood. I went from Puerto Rico to the Santa Fe Institute around 2012 to ask McCarthy this question. Wow. But the event was canceled and I never saw him. Oh. This has been an excellent interview. So it's more of just a comment, but we'll make that the last question. But one thing I just wanted to bring up, because it plays such a strong, beautiful, and just resonant role in the Border trilogy, and that is the character and personality of Mexico. What is your sense of his? What's his grasp of Mexico? What is his appreciation of Mexico?
Well, I think kind of in response to what Jeffrey said, I think that's true. That's absolutely true of John Grady Cole. At the end of the novel, Abuela has died during the time that he's in Mexico, and he goes to the little cemetery, which is specifically like a Tejano cemetery. And he reads the names on the gravestones and he knows all of them. And they're complicated names. You have to know what kind of family relationships they're signifying in order to really understand what you're looking at. And he knows all of them. And this is the moment, he feels perhaps the greatest loss because this woman was such an important part of his life. And as we said earlier, what was really the maternal presence when his mother wasn't. So, Jose Limon has argued, I really like this argument, that John Grady Cole can be thought of as in part kind of Tejano because of how his identity works. Now, whether he understands Mexico is a different question because he doesn't, or at least in a lot of ways. He speaks fluent Spanish. He knows his way around. He can get along with people. But one of the reasons that novel drifts towards tragedy, again, to use that word, is because at some level, he just doesn't get it. It's another country. And it's not where he grew up. It's not actually, Tejanos and Mexicans are not the same, right? These are slightly different cultures in a lot of ways. So I like that novel is nuanced in that sense. It understands the difference in these kinds of communities. And frankly, they're, the way that they are illegible to a white kid who rides down there and kind of tries to pursue his dream, which he does admirably. He is, not to discount his status as a good person, but but it is a different place. That's something that's been debated. You know, you can read different takes on McCarthy's presentation of Mexico for sure, but I sort of like that, you know, his protagonist fails to understand it in some kind of important way.
Well, I believe we should end it there. This has been a very wide-ranging, kaleidoscopic, fantastic discussion. I really appreciate. I feel very deepened by it, and I have a lot of what you say frames my future reading of McCarthy for sure. Any last words before we close?
This is such a great project. I love the idea of cultivating these kinds of conversations. I forgot what you called it on the website, these little intellectual
platoons.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah.
You know, of places to talk about stuff that's big, that's art, that's, I mean, not to discount, right, the small, the wonderful individual portraits that novelists can give us, but that's always been what I loved, is the big stuff, the stuff you can get your teeth into. So I think this is just a great project.
Thank you. Thank you for your professional work. Thank you for all of your not only your scholarship on Cormac McCarthy, but your appreciation of him and your sense of stewardship over his body of work. I really appreciate that. And maybe we can have you back again sometime.
Oh, I'd love to, for sure.
Good luck with your endeavors. Thanks.
Thanks so much.
Bye.